Today we're going to be continuing and kind of coming in for a landing slowly on this series that we started in the fall called On Earth as It Is in Heaven. And we've been discovering a lot of different things. In fact, what Jesus has been doing as we've looked at his life and his ministry and his words over the past few months is really taking some of the pictures that many of us have drawn and some of the descriptions that many of us have written about Jesus, and he's really been kind of shredding those politely in front of us and saying, you thought you knew me, but indeed maybe there are things about me that you didn't know. I think we have that tendency as people to try to categorize, and we try to create some sort of understanding of who Jesus is, and yet what Jesus continually does is challenge our thinking and challenge our conventions, because Jesus is a living God, amen? And so he is not static. He is not someone that we can put into a box. He's not somebody that any one of us can intellectually completely wrap our minds around. So as we've been looking at his life and his ministry over and over again, it's like he takes these things that we thought we knew and he goes, not quite, but you're close. And he kind of brings us to some new understanding and shows us some new things. And also in the process of this, we're learning some very specific things that fly in the face of what many people in our culture think about Jesus. That Jesus is not establishing a religion, and we see that today. We see very clearly today that religion is actually the antithesis of what Jesus is trying to create. And Jesus, in his effort to bring heaven to earth, understands, and he wants us to understand, that religiosity will actually get in the way of us bringing heaven to earth, making heaven a reality in the places that we live and play and expend our lives and spend our energy. At the beginning of the book of Matthew, there's this sermon that we've been walking through, the Sermon on the Mount. And I just want to remind you that in this sermon, people have gathered to this hillside from all walks of life. In the same way that Jesus at his birth, we just talked about this a couple nights ago, in the same way that Jesus at his birth gathered so many different people from so many different places. In the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, we have Jesus gathering so many people from so many different walks of life and different places. And we have people at every end of the spectrum spiritually. We have people like the disciples who are incredibly interested in Jesus. They are absolutely enthralled with his message. They're compelled by what he has to say. And then there are people certainly in this crowd that are the stragglers that maybe are mildly interested in Jesus. Maybe they've heard some things. Maybe some of these things sound like some of the promises that they've heard from other people before. And even though they've been burned, there's still some curiosity. Whatever the case is, we have people from every different background, every different walk of life, now standing here in front of Jesus, and Jesus is the centerpiece of what he's talking about. So we have lots of people, lots of understanding, lots of varying levels of commitment. These things are all very important as we see what he says next. And then we have one Jesus in the middle of this. And what's fascinating is at the end of this sermon, Jesus says something that I think we might find somewhat surprising, because Jesus, through the course of what we've been looking at, has been very welcoming, right? He's been the Jesus who has brought peace and hope and understanding to the people who had felt alienated by the religious elite. He's the person who has said that the kingdom of God is something that can be had and experienced and lived in this present life. He's opened up their mind, their understanding that now these people, us, we can live in relationship with God. And what's fascinating is that right at the very end of this message, he kind of moves this in a direction that is somewhat challenging for these people. He actually says some things that's going to create a sense of tension in their own lives. He makes a distinction. He draws a line. And basically what he's saying is this. He's saying, if this kingdom life now, if this idea that God is not simply a God who is waiting for you to fly away someday to someplace far away in heaven, but if this is a God who comes near to us and is here to be with you and for you, if this God, if this life of the kingdom is attractive to you, if connecting with your Creator, if living with a sense of awareness of what is going on in the unseen, the invisible, the spiritual that is all around you, if that's something that you've been longing for, if living a life of purpose and meaning is something that you've been hungry for, if that is the case, then you need to hear this. This is what he says. I want you to just pick up in verse 13 of Matthew chapter 7. If you have a Bible, you can open there, and if not, just follow on the screen with me. But Jesus says this. Looking at this group of people, if this is you, if this is them, if this is us, he says, Enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction. And those who enter by this gate are many. And I just want to remember that we're talking about entering. We're talking about entering the kingdom of heaven. And if we take this back, and maybe you weren't here, so I'll just say this, but if you take this back to the beginning of the series, Jesus is talking about entering the kingdom now. He's talking about a reality in which we can live in the present. So he says, enter by the narrow gate. And then he says in verse 14, for the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few. And again, he's talking about now. Then he says, beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will recognize them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? So every healthy tree bears good fruit, but the diseased tree bears bad fruit. A healthy tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a diseased tree bear good fruit. And every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus you will recognize them by their fruits. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons? And now Jesus is moving this to a future reference. So he's talking about now and he's talking about the future. He says, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many mighty works in your name? And then will I declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell and the floods came. And if you grew up in Sunday school, you probably learned a few songs to this one, right? The rains came and the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall, because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell and the floods came and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. And when Jesus finished these sayings, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one who had authority and not as their scribes. So Jesus is bringing this sermon that he's been preaching to a landing. And as he does this, he looks at these people and he says, if you want this life that we've been describing, then listen to what I'm saying. And he says, we have gates and we have roads and we have wolves and we have sheep and we have trees and we have fruit. And then there's this conversation, and then we have houses that are built on two foundations, one on rock and one on sand. And all of this is Jesus looking at these people saying this: you have to choose. You have to choose. There's a decision that needs to be made in this entire conversation of what I'm talking about. This past few days, I've mentioned this at some of our services over Christmas. I've had some family in town, and I forgot how competitive my family is. And so, because I live with 3 girls that are not very competitive, and so they're just kind of like always cool. They're like, oh, we'll just do whatever. And like they lose a game, they're like, let's do it again. And I'm like, I don't want to do it again. We lost. And so I've been living like in the last few days. We've been playing like foosball, and we've got these different games we play, and we've avoided any major family conflict, but it's been very close, because we are a very competitive family. And I realize that I come by this like very naturally. So this isn't something I just came up with on my own. What I now know is we are all a product of our environment. And my environment growing up must have been very competitive. But I'm a competitive person. And about 6 or 7 years ago, there was this group of college students who invited me to play indoor soccer with them once. And so they formed this team and said, hey, would you come play? And so I got on the team, and I was like the oldest guy out there. And there was this one guy who had played some collegiate soccer also. And so he was on our team. And I just started getting a little bit competitive with this guy because it seemed like he got more minutes than I did. And so I wanted minutes, even though I'm like, twice his age. I want the same number of minutes. So this guy's kind of driving me just a little bit crazy because I'm competitive for the minutes. And so every game, I'm kind of like, I'm calling him out. And there's times I'm like, hey, I'm calling his name. I don't want to say it. You might know him. But I'd say, hey, get in here. Like, come on. Like, it's time to swap out. And he'd come over, and then I'd be playing. Next thing you know, he's subbing somebody else out. And so he's just driving me crazy, right? Like, the guy's driving me nuts. So it's one night we go to play this other team, and this other team happened to be a few players short. And as they were a few players short, he knew some of the people on that team. And so he decided, and I don't know how a person does this, but he decided that he would sub in and out for both teams. And so at one point, I'm like losing my mind because he's like playing. We'd sub him out and he'd sub in on their team. And I'm like, this is a league. Like, this is like professional level amateur Spokane soccer. Like, you can't do this. Like, somebody say something, And so finally, like, I'd had it. Like, finally, like, anything I know about being patient, kind, loving, or sensible went out of my mind. And I looked at him and I said, you have to choose which team you're on. And he goes, well, I get more playing time on this one, so I'll choose this one. And I was like, dang it, we just lost our best player. Like, this can't happen, right? We have to choose. You have to choose. There are times in life when we have to make a decision about what team we're going to play on. And what Jesus is saying in this moment to this group of people, after all of these beautiful illustrations and pictures and mind-blowing moments of what's available when you have a relationship with your Creator, in all of this, Jesus comes to a place and says, you have to make a decision. You have to choose. And in fact, if you look at what he says about himself, he says, anyone who hears these words of mine. So if there's any question about whether or not Jesus brings people back to a place of making decisions about who he is, this is one of those times that stands out. He draws a line. He says, me and my teaching and what I'm saying is the deciding factor. It's the delineating point. You have to make a conclusion about me. Now, it's really important as you hear this, and I think this is critical, it's really important as you hear this, that this is not Jesus saying, well, you better do this or else. I know that's the way many of us hear this because of maybe if you've grown up in a religious background or you've been a part of something that was spiritually abusive, you might hear this. You might hear, well, you better listen or else these things are going to happen to you. But what is Jesus saying? What is he really saying here? Well, the assumption that Jesus has in all of this for his plan for people on earth is that these individuals, these people, as they get to know him, that they would become his students, that there would be this level of admiration for Jesus, that there would be this enthrallment with his words, that there would be this sense of being amazed by who he is, that there would be moments spent in his presence that would be so dynamic and so powerful that there would be a continual, ongoing longing to be instructed by him and to be guided by him. He's assuming, Jesus is saying, listen, I assume that when you've come in contact with me, that there would be something that's so powerful that you would say to yourself, I want this person to lead me. I want this person to guide me. I want every aspect of my life, how I work and play and think and spend time with friends and use my energy, that all of those things would be directed and guided by you, that you could help me with all of these things. That's the assumption here. What Jesus is creating is a society of Jesus. It's a society of people. It's a culture of people who look and think and act and smell like Jesus because they're being led by him. There's an assumption in this. You have to make a decision because in all of this, it's assumed that eventually you would be living your life in a way that says, wherever I go, whatever I do, I'm doing these things in his name. Even at work, even the most mundane task, even the most benign conversation, all of it somehow being guided and led and lived in Jesus. That's what he assumes. And in order for that to happen, you have to choose. You have to choose. You're either a student of Jesus or you're not a student of Jesus. You're either excited about what he has to say or you're not. You're either like waking up every day going, man, I really want Jesus, or you're not doing that. You can't just say you love Jesus and not be a student of him. Notice that there are only two groups in all of these illustrations. There are those on the wide path and there are those on the narrow path. And there are sheep and there are wolves and there are builders of houses, but there's only two builders of houses. See, Jesus is really clear here. You're the one or the other. It's challenging. This is challenging because we live in a culture, and maybe this is you. Maybe you come to this, and I think that sometimes we have to come to these moments and look at Jesus and be challenged ourselves because we live in a culture and we're a part of a culture that says, well, it's not okay to make distinctions like this. And our culture says, hey, well, let everybody come as they come. Just take everyone as they come and just accept everybody as they are. And there are really no distinctions. There's no delineation. You can't draw lines. And really the line our culture says, well, it's really about being sincere. Isn't that the case? Like, well, as long as you're sincere, as long as there's earnesty in this. But Jesus, he's challenging that. He's saying, no. It's not just everybody do their own thing sincerely. He uses this brilliant metaphor. You can be sincere, but he says everybody is on a road. I love this metaphor that Jesus is taking his teaching, and he's taking all of the things that he's shared with these individuals, and he's now calling this thing a way. He's calling this thing a road. It's a journey. It's a way in which we live our lives. He's saying everybody is on a road. And if you're on a road, if you're on a journey, if you're going a particular way, which is what the early Christ followers were called, it means you're going somewhere every minute of every day. Every single moment that you breathe in and breathe out, your life is headed someplace. Your faith and your beliefs, all of them, they're a path. That is common terminology around the world, by the way. That's not just Jesus saying that, right? People are always talking about the spiritual journey that they're on, right? That's very culturally acceptable to talk about people being on a journey. I think it's interesting sometimes when we see the parallel that in our culture and around the world, people can be on a variety of faith journeys. Jesus says, yes, absolutely, I agree. Everybody is on a journey. Everybody is doing something that is going somewhere. Everybody believes certain things that are taking them someplace. That is true. And what Jesus is saying is agreeing with that. The things that you believe, the things that are in this part of your journey, they actually have outcomes in this life that you're living. Everybody, Jesus says, has faith commitments. And all of those faith commitments are taking you someplace. Now, maybe this is you, or maybe this is somebody that you know, I don't know. But there are people who object to this and say, well, wait a second, I don't have any faith commitments. I object to that idea. I object to the idea that I have faith commitments. You say, I'm not a religious person. I'm not pursuing these sorts of things. I'm not into that sort of thing. But Jesus says something very differently. He says, all of us build a house. We all pick a road. Even if you're irreligious, you still choose a road. And so the question isn't whether or not you're a disciple or not. The question is, who are you a disciple of? It's not a question of whether or not you're being taught or not. The question is, who are you being taught by? That's what Jesus is saying. And so the question is, who teaches you? Who disciples you? You're somebody's disciple. That's what Jesus is basically saying to them, and it's what his words are saying to us. He's saying everybody is a disciple of something. The question isn't that. The question is, who are you a disciple of? Or what are you a disciple of? We learn to live life from somebody else. There are no exceptions to this. Everybody is a disciple. Human beings have to learn from other human beings. From the very earliest stage, notice the way that we are born and come into this world. Everything about humanity and human behavior says that you and I need other human beings to guide us and teach us and show us. Everything we understand about the brain and neuroplasticity says that even as we age and we grow, we continue to change our thinking. Our minds are shifted. There are things that have influences, and we can change direction because of what other people do in our lives. Everybody is taught by somebody. And it's hard to come to terms with this in our culture, especially in our culture, in a Western culture, because we love to think that we're our own person, right? Even hearing this, you go, wait a second. Even as Christ followers, there's this tendency, and this is where you need to be aware of this, there's this tendency, even as Christ followers, like, no, wait, it was my decision. There's this me thing. There's this, it's my decision. I'm the master of my own fate. We have this tendency. But can I just say, we didn't come up with even that on our own. In fact, the fact that we believe something like that so adamantly is just the evidence of the mastery that those that have taught us have over us. See, the truth is we are all a disciple of several somebodies. They may be living, they may be dead. But there are people, there are poets, there are musicians, there are teachers, there are parents, there are peers who at very critical junctures in life, when something came up, when there was a crisis and we didn't know how to deal with it, when there was a tension and we didn't know how to resolve it, There were people who in those moments, they spoke something, they said something. There was a lyric to a song that somehow just resonated, and somehow it began to define a certain season of our life. All of these things shape us. We are the students of teachers, dead and alive. And all of these people have taught us how we will live our lives towards others and how we will live our life towards God, some good and some bad. In fact, everything that we do, everything that you and I do has been influenced by another person. The question is whether or not all of those influences are coherent. Doesn't this explain some of the incongruity that we experience? Like we have these longings, we have these desires, we have these things where we learned this, but now there's this, and how do we rationalize, or how do we reconcile all of these ideas? Well, sometimes it's impossible to reconcile these ideas because we have so many different teachers with so many different ideas that you can't possibly be coherent unless you decide to begin to evaluate the influence that those teachers have had on you. See, that philosophically is one of the significant growth moments in any person's life. When any one individual goes, wow, you know what, you're right. I've been influenced by all of these people. And then you begin to take a step back and acknowledge the kind of influence that they've had. When you begin to analyze the outcomes of those influences, at that moment, we begin to grow. We begin to get outside of ourselves, and we are then given the opportunity to make a decision about the kind of teacher that we would like to have. That is what Jesus is presenting to them and to us. He's saying, can you for a moment come outside of yourself and see that you're all on a road? And would you choose one that is coherent and beautiful and good? See, everybody has faith commitments. There is no neutrality. There is no all of these roads are going to the same destination. In the face of that cultural picture that's always being painted, Jesus says, no, there's two roads, and they have radically different outcomes. You're either moving further and further from the truth and closer to and possibly experiencing what he calls destruction or disintegration, a mess of a life, or he says you're moving closer and closer to truth, and you're moving closer to wholeness and beauty in your life. There is one or the other, and what he says makes the difference is him. He says, I make the difference. It's me. Which should be a great reminder that Jesus is the only one that says, the way of Jesus is the only faith system ever been put before people that says, the founder says, I am God. I am the founder, and I am God. There are systems that say that God can't become a man. There are systems that say God maybe could become a human being, but only Christianity says this is a once and for all incarnation of God. I am God, and I'm starting this new thing. It is Jesus. So just in this one area, just in this one thing that Jesus is saying, there is this divergence of roads. You either are on this one or you're not on this one, and it demands a response from us. Jesus is continually presenting to us a question that we have to answer, and that is, what do you say about me? What do you say about me? What do you say about who I am? See, he's not establishing religion. Jesus is not creating another system through which people could somehow achieve some level of, or some sense of God's pleasure with them. That is not what Jesus is doing. I know I've said this before, but I'll say it again. It's not as if Jesus was looking down, like God was looking down from heaven and said, you know what these people need is another religious system. We had plenty of them. Jesus says, I'm offering you something new. There is a new kind of spirituality that is not being manifested in the religions of this day, and I'm here to make it known. Everybody is religious in some way. Everybody is earning their way to some sort of ultimate place. And Jesus says, you can do it the religious way, or you can follow me. Now, how do we know this? Look at the two groups. Verse 21, this is really interesting, and I've taught on this before, but I just want to share this again. He says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. By the way, this is like one of those verses, sometimes you read it and people go, wait, this is like really freaky. And some of you might be, especially if you're living religiously, this could be very scary. Because Jesus says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many mighty works in your name? And then will I declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. So one response to this is, we are going to be incredibly insecure people, right? We're going to live on the edge. Like, God is angry, and every time it rains, he's crying, and it's because of something that we did, that kind of life, right? Like God is mad, and every time it thunders, it's because of something that we did, and he's going to strike us down, right? There's that way of living. Jesus says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. And then that's when he gives this parable. And he says there are two individuals, and these two individuals build two homes. And on the outside, these homes look the same. But underneath, they have radically different foundations, right? What is he saying? He's driving this point home. We like to think that the wide road is filled with people who are living some sort of grotesque, like obviously immoral life, right? Like they are the frat boys of all frat boys, right? That's the wide road. Like for me, like you picture the wide road, and I picture fraternities at Arizona State University, right? That's what I picture. Can I get an amen to that, right? Like that's what I picture. There's this tendency. But what Jesus is saying is, no, that's not the wide road. The wide road is anyone who is living by their own system. You've derived this. You've created this. This is about you and your effort. This is about your energy. How do we know? How do we know this? Because look at what Jesus says about the people who build on the sand. This is fascinating. Look at what he says is true about these people. Because he uses this illustration of the sand and the rock to describe the people that were saying, Lord, Lord. And so what kind of people were these? Well, first of all, there were people who had very good, very orthodox doctrine. These people believed the right kind of things about Jesus. They're people who come to him and call him Lord. And in the Greek, they're calling him this word kurios, right? This is the Greek equivalent of the Old Testament word Yahweh. So these are people who think rightly. These are people who have good theology. These are people who maybe went to Bible college. These are people who attended discipleship classes. These are people who read their Bible every day. These are people who these are the people that we really believe the right stuff. We fight for the right things. We stand up for the right doctrine. That's who these people are. And so they're orthodox in their doctrine. Not only that, they're emotionally involved. There's this moment where he says, Lord, Lord. They say to me, Lord, Lord. And that double use of his name, that kurios, is always a sense of emphasis. In the Jewish language, to the Jewish people, anytime somebody repeated a name, there was this intensity of emotion. That's why Jesus says, Martha, Martha. It was like this getting her attention, like, are you with me on this thing? That's why David said, Absalom, Absalom, Lord, Lord. These are people who are emotionally invested. And these are people who are active in service. They come to Jesus and they say, did we not prophesy in your name? You notice that Jesus doesn't deny that. He doesn't say, no, you didn't. Yeah, you did. You did. You prophesied in my name. They did these things. They were active, like they served at church, and they were ushers and greeters and Sunday school servants. They did all these different things, right? They did all this stuff. They served, and yet Jesus says, I never knew you. I never knew you. And I love that Jesus brings this to a relational point. It's not I didn't know about you. It's not about your behavior. He's not surprised. He just says, I never knew you. There was no relationship. We never had one. So follow the logic here. Is there anything wrong with believing the right things and having orthodox theology? No, there's nothing wrong with that. Is there anything wrong with being emotionally invested? No, there's nothing wrong with being emotionally invested. Is there anything wrong with being involved in ministry and serving? No, obviously, authentic Christ followers are frequently going to be characterized by these things. But Jesus says these are also the traits who will see on that day, they'll hear him say, I never knew you. So the presence of these traits does not demonstrate that you are a follower of Jesus. These people have an intellectually stimulating faith. They have an emotionally gratifying faith. They have a socially redemptive faith. All of us want that. Humans want that. That's things that people are pursuing everywhere. But what Jesus is saying is it is possible to want those things and to pursue those things and not really want God. Dallas Willard, who wrote a beautiful book on the Sermon on the Mount called The Divine Conspiracy, describes the disconnect between people who are truly disciples of Jesus and those who are still in it for themselves. He says, anyone who is not a continual student of Jesus and who nevertheless reads the great promises of the Bible as if they were for him or her is like someone trying to cash a check on another person's account. At best, it succeeds only sporadically. So what are the indicators? Well, Jesus says really it's just one thing. He says, not everyone who says these things, but the one who does the will of my Father. And this is saying something so important. If you want this life of the kingdom, if you desire this awareness of God's nearness, if you long for the Spirit that Jesus promised us to be prompting and moving and guiding you in your life, you have to give up on your own will. You have to. You have to. That's the difference. Jesus says it is no longer about you. You are not abusing God and his teaching. You are not manipulating the messages of Jesus. You're not wanting things because of your will anymore. Now you are solely and completely living with this understanding that you have a purpose, and it is to be guided by, to be submitted to God. That's what he's saying. See, people, this is fascinating. We want the love, and we want the meaning, and we want the purposefulness, we want the stuff, but we also want to maintain control, don't we? Like, we just want to maintain, can I get an amen to that? We love maintaining control. That's why Jesus says this road is narrow. That's why Jesus says few find it. Because the deciding factor is whether or not you and I are willing to follow the way of Jesus and sacrifice of ourselves and even our own will. And that goes against everything that all of our teachers and all of our poets and all of our peers have taught us. We have to surrender. And Jesus says, those individuals who never know me, those individuals who never experience the sweetness, the goodness of the kingdom at hand, are those who fail to submit their own will to me. It's your will. You're doing these things. And life is disintegrating, and Jesus disappoints you, and the church lets you down because it's still about you. See, the mark of an authentic Christian is not moral character, it is not greater character, it is not less addiction, it is not fewer mistakes, it's not cleaner lives. Those things may happen, but those aren't the marks. The mark of an authentic Christian is somebody who is teachable, somebody who is flexible, somebody who is pliable in the hands of God, somebody who is willing to admit that they are wrong and that they need to be guided by somebody. They're listening to God. They're the quickest ones to repent, to say, no, that was totally the wrong direction. They're not the ones who do everything perfectly, but they're the first ones to say, that wasn't perfect, and I know it. Why is this so difficult? Because we have to die to ourselves. Dying to ourselves. Over and over again, this message of Jesus comes back to that. No matter where you go, no matter what he says, all of it always comes back to you and I have to die to ourselves. A choice has to be made. And the choice is, will I listen to Jesus or will I listen to me? Will I continue to demand that I'm in control? See, an authentic Christian is a person who doesn't just say, Lord, Lord. An authentic Christian is somebody who says, you are Lord. And it is not a theological definition. It is not empirical evidence that has helped you come to a decision. It is a condition of your heart that says, you lead me and you guide me. That's what this is about. So what does it mean to build your house on the rock? What is Jesus saying? It simply means to admit that a person can only be a Christian by grace alone. A person can only have this life by following Jesus and submitting to him. And when you do that, you know what happens? The opposite of what Jesus described. He says, I know you. I know you. When we submit our wills to the will of the Father, he says, I know you. And suddenly the prayers that you've prayed in desperation, asking for God to work miraculously, somehow those prayers get transferred into a conversation where now you are interacting with and you are dialoguing with your Creator. Now your activities, your behavior, it's not a test whether or not you're passing or failing, but now the things that you're engaged in every single day, they become things that have meaning and purpose, and now you're living them out and saying, is this where you'd like me to go? Is this how you'd like me to handle this? There is life that comes to this. The doctrines that we believe are no longer things that we have to defend or hold to, but they become these beautiful expressions of God's love and His faithfulness and His truth in our lives. All of these things come to life. We're no longer arguing and fighting. We're simply living in and walking out this beautiful thing that is the kingdom of God at hand. He says, this is yours. You just have to let go. And you can have it. Jesus says, come to me, and I'll give you rest. And you will weather the storms now and in your future.